Today's show is brought to you by Audible, and right now you can get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/joined-up. There's over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle or MP3 player. Thanks for tuning in to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, a weekly show featuring interviews with fantastic authors sharing their personal stories on how and why they write. There's hints and tips for aspiring writers and great book reviews from top bloggers. Follow us on Twitter at JU Podcast. Right, cue the cheesy theme tune.
Put down your pen and stop your typing. Grab yourself a drink, 'cause it's Joined Up Writing.
Hello and welcome to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, where a little procrastination can go a long way. I'm Wayne Kelly, and it's episode 70 that brings you a fascinating chat with gritty thriller writer Marnie Riches, talking about her own unique writing journey and the background to her George McKenzie and Manchester Gangland books. We've also got another review in Book Blogger's Corner from regular blogger Bibliomaniac Catherine Sunderland. Before we get started with all of that, a little update from me. I continue to refine, redraft, slice and dice my debut crime novel Safe Hands. Before I began my latest round of changes, I sat down and mercilessly murdered a number of my darlings, or scenes that I've been clinging on to for far too long, in the hope that I could make them work with my revised structure. It was actually very liberating, and my only regret is that I didn't do it sooner. Following that, I made myself a to-do list for my next round of changes, and many of the changes revolve around the phrase, "she hasn't died yet." Without giving any spoilers, let's just say that in my original draft I killed a character fairly early in the book, and by the time I began my first structural edit I realised it would have been much more effective and have more impact later on. So using the power of Scrivener software, I just grabbed the scene and dragged it further down the timeline. Of course, that has had huge impacts on the rest of the book, and so the next phase of my editing will be focused on sorting all of that out. So now, on a daily basis, through gritted teeth, I repeat the mantra, "You're making the book better." But what about you? Do you fret about making drastic changes when redrafting? Do you have to fight the fear of self-doubt? Let me know at joinedupwriting.co.uk, tweet me at JUPodcast, or drop me a line over at the blog WayneKellyWrites.com. Right, let's quit it with the woe is me routine and get to the real reason you bought a ticket, which is today's interview with Marnie Riches. Marnie grew up on a rough estate in Manchester, aptly within sight of the dreaming spires of Strangeways Prison. Having authored the first 6 books of HarperCollins' children's Time Hunters series, her award-winning best-selling George McKenzie crime thrillers for adults were inspired, in part, by her own youth and time spent in the Netherlands as a student. Her new Manchester series about the criminal underworld of the UK's second city launched in March 2017, and her latest book in that series, The Cover-Up, has just been released and is available from all your favourite booksellers. So let's hear what Marnie had to say. Marnie, thanks a million for coming on Joined Up Writing Podcast. It's great to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
No problem. How's things?
Yeah, great. 2017 was a very busy year for me. I wrote 2 books. I wrote the second in my Manchester series called The Cover-Up, which is coming out on this Thursday. And then I wrote the 5th book in the George McKenzie series, and I just got my copy edits back for that the other day. So it's busy after a couple of weeks of solid flu.
Nice, lovely. You're recovering from that. So yeah, why don't you start by telling us about, you mentioned your Manchester Gangland series there and The Cover-Up, which by the time this show comes out in a couple of weeks that'll be out. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that and the Manchester Gangland series in general?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'd written a few George McKenzie books, which are a bit like The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo meets Silence of the Lambs, I guess. It's, they're set in Amsterdam and they have a serial killer element to them usually, and it surrounds trafficking. But my publisher came to me a couple of years ago when we were negotiating a new contract and said, well, you're from Manchester. How about you do a series, say, in Manchester? And you could be like the Martina Cole of the North. And I'd grown up on a really rough council estate in North Manchester and knew all about life on Manchester's toughest streets. And so I said, yeah, that's a brilliant idea. And then Born Bad, which was the first Manchester gangland book that I wrote, was born. And it's very much a tale of North versus South. Manchester, I hasten to add, and a lot of it is also about battle of the sexes. So, I mean, gangland is quite a sexist environment. So it's about how the women are impacted by the men's activity, and there's rivalries. There's a big host of characters. A big host of characters, a big cast of characters, I should say, and they're all larger than life, as you would expect many Mancunians to be. Actually, quite quirky people up here. And it was great fun to do. It was quite difficult to do, though, after doing the George books, which had a standard police procedural narrative framework to them, where a crime gets committed and the good guys try and solve it. So it was very difficult to write a criminal-led story and decide what shape that was going to take.
Yeah, well, I noticed, because I know in the latest book that's just coming up, so you've got this character, Sheila OBrien.
Yeah.
It sounds like, from what you've already said, was it fun to write that kind of rounded? I know that you George McKenzie in your first books was kind of a very rounded kind of female character and that kind of thing, but it's kind of from looking at it from the criminal aspect of it, was that quite interesting and fun to play with somebody that's kind of on the other side of it?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, some of my characters I think you'd love to hate. So Paddy O'Brien, for example, who still does feature in the cover-up, even though, well, you have to read it. I mean,
no spoilers.
I'm not going to. Yeah, no spoilers. It's really difficult not to. But he's a really odious man. He's your archetypal psychopath. But he had a very tragic upbringing, but has turned into a monster. But then Sheila OBrien, his wife, you can't help but root for her and her business partner Gloria Bell, I think, because these are two women who really have had a rough ride, and all they're trying to do is do right by their families, really. So it was fun for me to explore quite realistic characters, I think, because you do meet people like them in real life, and just look into the nitty-gritty of why they do the terrible things that they do. Yeah, so it stretched me in different ways to the George books.
Yeah, a bit of a change of pace.
Yeah, and the second book, The Cover-Up, in the Manchester series, it focuses much more on what happens with Sheila and Gloria. So whereas the first book, Born Bad, is quite full of testosterone, and we learn loads about Paddy O'Brien and his henchman Conky McFadden and the Bodlingtons from North Manchester, who are, again, two men. You've got Johnny Margulies and Tariq Khan. I just think it's a much more woman-centric story this time around, because we see how Sheila takes the reins of South Manchester, and she's a force to be reckoned with, which was great fun.
It's good. Were there any kind of inspiration, either in real life or from stuff that you've read as regards those kind of characters? Because I suppose there's not as many of those kind of archetypes to draw on, because they're not as, which is a good thing, they're not as prevalent in kind of popular fiction and stuff. Those kind of women that, I mean, I know they're out there, but they're not as prevalent in, particularly in fiction and stuff like that. So, kind of, where did you get your inspiration for those characters from, and kind of how did you base?
They're taken from real life, actually. I mean, Manchester has got a very genuine criminal underworld, and everyone knows someone who's involved with that kind of organised criminality, and you see people. If you don't see people on the streets, then you certainly see them in the Manchester Evening News. And these are tough cookies. These are people who come from the wrong side of the tracks, and as children, they face lack of opportunity, and they've managed to make their fortune by, getting on the wrong side of the law. And they're tough. If you go to the council estates in and around Manchester and you meet some of the women, not everyone's involved in crime, but the women are by and large tough as old boots, because
to survive, yeah.
Exactly. They have to bring families up in very, difficult circumstances. And the women in my family, indeed, my mother's generation, my mother and my auntie and my cousins, they're all tough. Well, my mother's dead now, unfortunately, but, you're talking about very hard fighters, women that triumph against the odds and manage to put food on the table, and are often held back by bad men, not very good men. Well, yeah. So it's taking inspiration from real life. I think that Northern women are tough cookies, and so we may not see them in fiction, much of which is penned by very middle class white people. Mm-hmm. But I'm not from that kind of background. I've grown up in a multi-ethnic Manchester and come from the poorest of the poor in terms of areas, and people on the bones of their arses. So I've drawn from my experience of real life, and it doesn't bother me that there's no precedent been set in fiction apart from Martina Cole and Kimbo Chambers. They write about the East End, but obviously
different
I'm
part
writing
of the
about
country.
the North,
Yeah.
It's a different kettle of fish, really.
No, it's great, as you say, that you're pushing forward with it, and it's putting these characters out there.
Yeah. Like I said, there are quite a few writers in the southeast that write about London's gangland, and they're doing that successfully. I'm just thinking also of Dredda Say Mitchell, who she's a black writer, and there aren't enough black and minority ethnic writers writing gangland thrillers that have got genuinely diverse casts of characters, but that's something I try to do.
Yeah, absolutely. As you say, you're bringing it from your background, and that you're drawing on what you know. So let's just take a step back a little bit then, speaking of that, and look at how you came into writing in the first place. I mean, did you always want to be a writer? Where did that come from?
Well, when I was at university, I did write a novelisation of an epic 12th century Dutch poem about Charlemagne the Great. And I thought that I was going to be like the next Tolkien. But looking back at it, it was just as well I stashed it in a wardrobe for 17 years, because it was absolute cack. It was terrible. And I did I shelved my writing aspirations for a number of years until I was in my mid to late 30s. And then my kids were little, and I knew that I'd been a professional fundraiser for nearly 20 years at that point. And I knew I didn't want to do it anymore. And I dabbled with property development, but I couldn't do that anymore because of the housing market crash. And I decided that because my kids were little and I read a lot of children's fiction myself, I wanted to be a children's writer. And I did start out doing that. And I rejigged the Dutch story that I'd written as a YA historical thriller, and it didn't work. But then I penned a couple of middle grade novels, and I loved nothing better than a fart gag. And in fact, certainly in these Manchester books, as well as the George McKenzie books, there's always some dark humour running through them, which you don't normally see in crime fiction, actually. But I like to put that in there because that's how life is. And I'm sure that a lot of that has come from my starting out as a children's writer. Because you have to have humour in kids' books, really, to make them work, especially that younger age group of middle grade.
Keep them interested.
Yeah, exactly. And my first break in publishing was I was commissioned to write the first 6 books in HarperCollins series called Time Hunters, which was historical fiction for 7+-year-olds. So it was all different periods in history, and they were absolutely beautiful books, really well illustrated. And they had some nice mild humour in them and were great fun to write. So those are my writing origins, really. And it was only when I failed to place my own middle grade novels that I realised that I was better suited to writing something for a much older readership.
Well, when did you realise that? Was that from you reading crime?
Yeah, I was an avid crime fiction reader and had got really very seriously into Scandi Noir. When the Stieg Larsson Millennium trilogy came out, I couldn't get enough of it. And then I went on to Joe Nesbo and couldn't get enough of his books. And it was heavily influenced at the time by the fact that I was married to a half Swede. So my in-laws, there's Swedish on that side, and we'd been to Stockholm to see my ex-husband's family and stuff. And it resonated with me. And also the fact that I'd done German and Dutch at university, which, of course, they're Nordic cultures northerly cultures as well. And when I realised Stieg Larsson was dead, and I loved Lisbeth Salander because she was so kick-ass and refreshing, I thought, well, he's dead and nobody else seems to be doing that kind of kick-ass heroine. And I thought, well, I could do something like this and write a more challenging book than a kid's book, more multi-layered, multifaceted, but set it in Amsterdam and have a different kind of a heroine who is, more a woman's imagining of a heroine than a man's.
And that's where your George McKenzie books came from.
Yeah, that's where George McKenzie came from. So I had The Girl Who Wouldn't Die written quite quickly. And, of course, that book went on to be a top 40 Kindle bestseller and won an award. So I
you're
did
vindicated.
Quite well with my debut.
So when you wrote that, did you... before you started writing that, or when you decided to write it, obviously you were published, as you say, with HarperCollins children's side of things. So did you approach another publisher as you were writing that, or did you approach HarperCollins, the adult, or how did that work? And did you kind of get any resistance? Was it a case of, well, hang on a minute, you write children's fiction, so... and now you're telling us you're writing crime. Did you kind of get any resistance or kind of raised eyebrows, or was it whatever, just show it to us and we'll have a look at it?
Well, it was a tortuous path to publication, I have to tell you. When I started writing, I got an agent very quickly who represented my children's work. But then after a couple of years, things weren't really working out, and I changed agents and got a new children's agent who was very keen on my middle grade work, but I'd already penned The Girl Who Wouldn't Die. And the guy at the agency there who handles crime fiction decided it wasn't quite for him. And I was left with a children's agent who then retired a couple of months later. So then I had no agent and nobody representing my crime fiction. So I was up the creek without a paddle in some ways, but I was lucky that when I subbed The Girl Who Wouldn't Die as my lead manuscript rather than the middle grade one that I've been working on with the retired woman, I got picked up very quickly. Well, I got offers from two agents very quickly and chose to go with my agent now, who's Caspian Dennis at Abner Stein, and he really went for the book. He really enjoyed it and liked my narrative voice and my character, which was great. But it did take Avon at HarperCollins. They were very keen on it immediately, but it did take a year to get that publishing deal nailed down because they restructured the imprint at the time we were negotiating. So it just took forever. And my agent was, he was convinced that it was the home for me, and they were very keen on George McKenzie and my writing style. So in that respect, it all fell together quite quickly. But, there was quite a bit of anguish in between time from my old agent retiring and getting a new agent for The Girl Who Wouldn't Die. It was a really difficult time emotionally because I didn't know what was going to happen or if my adult fiction would take off. And then, of course, we had this year's wait for Avon to sign on the dotted line while they did some internal restructuring. So, it might seem to people on the outside that it's all very easy when you get your debut deal, and for some people it is. They write a novel, it gets published, and they're a great hit, and they're a Sunday Times bestseller. But it's never been like that for me. It never has. And it took me a good 10 years from starting to write seriously to my, The Girl Who Wouldn't Die coming out. And even then, it was initially ebook only. It's only now going to be in print.
Right. So it's quite a long journey.
It's a hugely long journey and has been agonising in parts. But Avon have always been very supportive of my writing. And I've been lucky that, I've sold a lot of those George McKenzie books and I've got a very loyal readership. So it's a case of all's well that ends well. And my agent is fully committed and very, very supportive. So I feel blessed.
So in that kind of that time that you had where you're waiting, this year-long period where it looked like it was going to go, but you weren't quite sure, were you continuing to write more George McKenzie already at that point? Or you decided it was going to be a series, or was your mental state as regards whether it's going to go or not, did that affect what you did and how you approached it?
Well, it was a difficult time for me. I didn't, at that stage, I didn't know that the George McKenzie books were going to be a series. I had hoped so. And in fact, when the deal came through, it was a 3-book deal, which was great. But I didn't start writing The Girl Who Broke the Rules and The Girl Who Walked in the Shadows until I'd, signed the contract and done the copy edits on the first book. So what I did in that year was I'd moved house. So I did a massive building project.
To take your mind off it.
Well, I mean, the house needed doing anyway. It was an absolute wreck. I have a habit of buying houses that have been owned by dead people and then doing them up. So I was doing the building work and I wrote a woman's novel, so contemporary women's fiction, during that time. Well, I'd started doing a young adult novel, actually, that was meant to be a bit like the Percy Jackson books. And that didn't work. I got 30,000 words in and got writer's block, which is a very, very real thing and quite frightening. And when it didn't work and I'd been fanning around for a few weeks, I decided to start this women's book. And that came out really quickly and I was really pleased with it. And it's never managed to find a publisher. Because the women's market for a long time has only wanted psychological thrillers. But the market's changing now, so perhaps it'll find a home now because it's quite a funny book.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, Bridget Jones meets Train Spotting, but for middle-aged women.
That is a great setup for it. I like the log line.
But I just had to keep busy.
Yeah, and you obviously just like to write. That's the thing that kind of comes out of all of that, because you just, throughout all of that stuff, you just continue to write stuff.
Well, there's always the worry. I mean, I do. A lot of people say you must write every day, and I don't agree with that. I think that it's really important to have fallow periods where you allow your brain to rest and you live a bit of life so that you've then got something to write about.
Some people call it filling the creative well sort of thing.
Yes. But if you take too much time off, then you run the risk of losing your mojo.
So it's that balancing act.
It is, yeah.
And obviously you've mentioned just in that little short bit there, so you kind of mentioned, so you started out with, well, if you go right back to the first novel that you wrote, obviously you wrote this novelisation of the poem or whatever it was, that first thing. You've written children's fiction, you tried your hand at YA, middle grade, contemporary women's fiction. Obviously you found a lot of success now with crime. So what are your thoughts on, do you think sometimes writers and sometimes publishers, do you think they worry too much about pigeonholing and Amazon classification and all that kind of stuff?
Actually, the one thing I really admire about Matt Haig is that he refuses to be pigeonholed in terms of the age group he writes for and the genre that he may write. And I think that that's right, actually. I think that a good writer can write. But what you do find, because psychological thrillers have been so very popular, a lot of writers who were previously women's fiction writers switched to psychological thrillers. So there has been less of that pigeonholing. There's been more fluidity between women's fiction and crime. So that's good. But often what they do, which is less good, is that they change the name. So they write something under a pseudonym, and that's always a real shame. And you do get children's writers who write. I've got a couple of mates who are children's writers, but who write their crime under a slightly different name, so that the brand, if you like, isn't confused. And it's silly, really. I don't know why you wouldn't, unless you're writing really close to the bone erotica and in one incarnation of yourself, and then you're doing stuff like picture books for babies. I don't see.
I think it's kind of I think it's kind of an historical thing, isn't it? Because I mean, other crime writers, and Stephen King did it early in his career. Is it Richard Bachman or Bachman books that he did? He had pseudonym. I think a lot of people live, and one of our other guests, and I know somebody that you're friends with, Mel McGrath.
Yeah, I've just finished reading that book.
Yeah, well, we're speaking, Mel's been on the show a couple of times, and the last time she came on, we had this conversation about, publishing under various different names, and she freely admitted that it was a nightmare. She said that if she could do it again, she'd basically just publish under one name. When she started off at a certain age, and she's got like MJ McGrath, she's got Mel McGrath, I think she's got Melanie McGrath, and I think she's got another one as well. She's got all these different things, and obviously, especially nowadays, with keeping up all the different social media profiles, you've got websites, you've got all these different identities.
Labour-intensive.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, and costly as well. You've got to start paying to set up websites and maintain those.
Yeah, and like you say, I think people do make a bigger thing out of it, really. And I think
it's publishers that worry about it more than readers and writers.
I think you're right. Because there's people that I read, like people like Chuck Wendig and people like that, who they write, he's written like YA, and I think he's written middle grade, and he's written crime stuff, he's written like paranormal type things, he's got horror, he's got like thriller.
There's an awful lot of crime writers that also write horror.
But it's kind of a thing, I guess, I hate the word because it kind of gets bandied around now everywhere, but this idea of brand, but it's creating this brand, isn't it, with as regards your name. And rather than it's like, you write, you're a crime writer or whatever, it's just, as you say, you're a writer, and it's more like they're buying your attitude, your voice, your style, and you write across multiple genres and stuff. I guess it's trying to get to that point, really, which, as you say, can be difficult when you're traditionally published, particularly because they're like, well, this is how we're marketing you and this is what you are.
I think to a certain extent the piper calls a tune. If your publisher says, well, we feel we're going to sell more of your books by doing this, then I think that you have to bow to their wisdom, because if you don't want to do that, then you'd be best off going down the self-publishing path, which some people do very, very successfully, and it gives them a degree of freedom. But what you hope to have from a publisher is their skill in selling books and their collective accumulated wisdom in marketing you successfully. So you stick to, the writer should write and the publisher should publish.
And is that kind of what you think about it? Obviously you write, as you say, you write across multiple genres, you've got all the books that you've kind of hoping to push out at some stage or do whatever with. Would you ever consider that down the line, if you had certain other types of genre or other types of books that you couldn't place other places, would you consider independently publishing them?
Yeah, I've had this conversation with my agent, because the last thing I would do would be to tread on his toes. His take on it is that, he's a wait and see kind of guy, because markets are quite fickle, and what may be difficult to place one year might be snapped up the next. And also, if you have a big hit with something, suddenly people are clamoring for your backlist and to see what else you've got. So I would do it eventually, but at the moment, I'm
happy to see what
to
happens.
stick to the trad route and to build my career that way. The only thing that's slightly difficult for me is that having been a professional fundraiser for 20 years, I've got a really good background in marketing and PR. So it's really tricky to keep my mouth shut and not stick my oar in.
That's what I was thinking, yeah, because it's obvious from, as you say, how you carry yourself online and the stuff that you've done. It's obvious you've kind of got experience, not just experience, but you probably know yourself from having lots of writer friends. Is a lot of writers they actively hate doing any of that stuff. They literally do just want to write, and they don't really want to have to do any of that stuff, which is not realistic nowadays, unfortunately.
I do my own PR.
I think you have to, don't you, regardless whether you're traditionally published or otherwise.
Yeah, but it is tiring. I mean, I write 2 books a year at the moment, and I'm hoping to go down to fewer. But I also do most of my own, I have done until recently, done most of my own PR and as much marketing as humanly possible, as though I was self-published, because I wanted to give my books as good a chance as possible. And I know that, publisher only has a certain amount of money and time allocated to push a book, and that is just the way it is. But as I get, I'm nearly 3 years down the line since The Girl Who Wouldn't Die came out. And now I am thinking, apart from the big PR stuff like appearing on panels and some TV work, actually it would be nice just to concentrate on writing and not have to spend hours and hours on Twitter, because it's absolutely lovely to engage with readers, but it means that you're spending those precious hours you should be spending with your kids or just watching telly, constantly hammering social media, so you never stop working, and that starts to get on your wick a bit after a few years. Sure.
Well, obviously, with all that, you mentioned your experience from your previous job, and you've kind of got strength in that area. What have you got? Any sort of tips for aspiring authors, or not aspiring authors, people that are new authors that are maybe they've got their first book coming out, whether that's independently published or traditionally published or whatever? Have you got just in general terms, things that tend to work in your opinion, or an approach that's kind of works, or a mindset that you have to get into?
Well, I think the most important mindset is not to give up, because, someone said to me, it's actually harder to stay published than it is to get published. So it's not like when you first get published that is the end of the adventure and you've achieved your goal, because the minute you've scaled one cliff face, you look up and there are multiple cliff faces to go, and it stretches on to infinity. So you have to be incredibly resilient and determined and really have a flawless work ethic to keep going. You have to get a thick skin and take the knocks, because when those edits come back, or when you get feedback on a synopsis, you don't always get the response you want. And you get some disgusting reviews off readers. People who have paid 99p for an ebook, so less than a tube of toothpaste, but they'll leave a full side of vitriol on Amazon or Goodreads to tell you quite how shit your book is. And it's like, that is their right to do so. Nobody can like everything, but I don't think I would expend quite that amount of energy to leave such a stinking review for something that cost 99p or was even free. And there, I believe if you've not got something nice to say, keep your mouth shut. But that's, everyone's entitled to their opinion, and by crikey, people voice them online. So when you're starting out, I think you need to toughen up really quickly. And as I did, actually, it came as a massive surprise when I started getting the odd crappy review. And, the odd crappy review, if you've had 600 reviews on a book, You know, there are quite a few even when the percentage is low, and
Of course,
they hurt.
yeah.
But you know, now I don't even read my reviews. And yeah, you've just got to keep going. You've got to be prepared to work as hard as you possibly can, and be prepared to support your fellow authors. And you should want to do that. I mean, I found that the crime community in particular is so supportive and friendly, and I've made some wonderful friends, and we help each other professionally. You know, we do stuff together, collaborative projects like Brit Crime, for example, was a great thing set up by Helen Smith, and it was a virtual festival that we did a summer stint of a couple of weeks, and then we did one at Christmas. And we all worked together. So it was across all the publishers and different subgenres.
Yeah, Brit Crime was great. I mean, we spoke to Helen. We had Helen on the show, and we actually took part in one of the Brit Crimes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, Helen's been really supportive to the show as well. She's put us in contact with lots of guests. I think you originally as well.
In contact with you.
Yeah, I think she did actually originally.
She's brilliant. She really is good and incredibly savvy at what she does. But of course, there are some debuts that just don't. You see them floundering. They don't really know what to do, and they don't really know that it's okay to be friendly with your fellow authors. You're not all in competition. You're just, they're your colleagues. And so for me, it's been very rewarding to work with other writers.
I had this very conversation with recently with Tony Schumacher. Well, last night actually, but it'll be on next week's show. But and saying that there is this mindset sometimes, and I was comparing it to book bloggers. When you start coming across book bloggers, they've got completely the opposite. They've got more of this community idea. It's like, well, they share their blogs and their reviews, and they'll say, go and check out so and so's reviews and go and look at their blogs, and they've got this little community, and they've recognised that it's actually a much better way to do it. It's much stronger. You get more. You're all sharing each other's stuff. You're getting more people. It lifts the whole scene, and it's the same. The same goes for authors. Just because they bought your book doesn't mean they're not going to buy someone else's. It doesn't work like that.
Amongst crime authors, there is that lovely collegiate atmosphere, and people are incredibly supportive. So to new people starting out, I would say keep your mind open for lovely things. Don't expect that it's all going to be cutthroat and.
It's only cutthroat in the books.
Yeah, no, I've been pleasantly surprised by that. But the main thing is to graft and to keep leaning into the punches, because they just don't stop.
They just keep coming.
Yeah, they just keep coming in a different way. Like the reader feedback is a really difficult one, and then you'll hope that your book's going to do better than it maybe does, or get more marketing than it ends up getting, and blah blah blah. And I think if you love writing, you have to just keep writing and keep trying to get better.
Okay, that's the perfect place to take a quick break and grab a review in this week's Book Bloggers Corner. Today, coming from our regular Catherine Sunderland, aka Bibliomaniac, who's reviewing Hydra by Matt Wesolowski.
This is the BBC Book Bloggers Corner.
Hydra by Matt Wesolowski. If you haven't read his first novel, 6 Stories, then you have to, because Hydra is a second novel and it can be read as a standalone, but the concept's so original you'll definitely want to read 6 Stories as well. The concept is that journalist Scott King investigates a real-life crime. He then broadcasts the interviews he manages to get with those involved with the crime, as well as offering his opinions about what might have happened as a podcast. He tries to solve the mystery over the course of 6 episodes, and the book is divided into 6 sections. It's such a different kind of idea, and it really works. It's both an incredibly effective and incredibly successful way to tell a story. The writing's so authentic, and the way Wesolowski mimics the introduction, content and voice of the podcast narrator is beyond impressive. It really feels as if you are listening to Scott King. It's a unique reading experience. Hydra is unforgettable. I think it's even better than 6 stories. The premise for Hydra is that in November 2014, Arla bludgeoned her mother, stepfather and younger sister to death with a hammer in an unprovoked attack. Incarcerated at a medium security mental health institution, she will only talk to Scott King. Scott King's 6 Stories podcast have become an internet success, and knowing that this will not only be a fascinating project from a journalistic point of view, but will also intrigue his audience, King agrees to interview her. The story that then reveals itself is dark, unsettling and chilling. Wesolowski maximises opportunities for creating tension, intrigue, cliffhangers and drama throughout the organisation of this book. He takes what could have become limitations with this choice of format and transforms it into something very effective. He's created something that plays with the conventions of the genre of crime fiction. We meet the person accused of the crime, people involved, and we listen to the facts and the opinions, but the real fascination and intrigue comes from the way that we only learn about these characters from what they say, and what they say in this specific context. Suddenly, there is huge importance on each detail and every word they say. Because of the structure of this book, it's possible to read it in one sitting. Well, actually, it's impossible to read it in any other way. It's so compelling. Don't be deceived by the speed at which you might read this novel. There's plenty of depth, skill and craft within these pages. Hydra is unique and unmissable.
Book Bloggers Corner.
There you go. That was a review of Matt Wesolowski's Hydra by Catherine over at bibliomaniacuk.blogspot.co.uk, and I'll put a link to all of that in the show notes as well. So let's get back to my chat with Marnie Riches, where I asked her about her obsession with finding new and interesting ways to kill characters. You said when you started writing crime, you're really keen to find new and interesting ways of people dying. So explain what you meant by that, and how you approach that in your work. I mean, how do you approach your research as regards all that stuff?
Well, I mean that statement's particularly true for the George McKenzie books. I mean, you know, my body count is quite high in my books, and I don't like to replicate murders that I've read or seen on telly elsewhere. So there's that thing where I feel compelled to be a bit innovative in how I kill off people. So, for example, in The Girl Who Walked in the Shadows, I tried to find the ultimate murder weapon that couldn't be traced forensically. And I spent ages researching whether it was possible or not to kill someone with an icicle. And I think someone has done this before in a book in the past, but I only found that out after I've written the book. And it turns out you can kill people with icicles. And I was just so pleased with myself because, of course, all the evidence melts away. And in the 5th George McKenzie book that's going to be out in April, The Girl Who Got Revenge, that again, you know, the killer tries to disguise his foul doings through use of prescription drugs. And of course, that's not that innovative, I guess, because that does go on in real life. But, you know, you have to keep your books novel. Do you know what I mean? The novelty of murder they have to feel fresh when you're reading about them, because I get so bored reading about plain old strangulation or, you know.
Well, it's often like little details I find, because I think Francis Ford Coppola, I've seen him talk quite a lot about the violence in Godfather, particularly the first film. And he always, wherever possible, he tried to have like one little funny little detail, even if it was, you know, somebody getting garroted by, you know, a cheese wire or whatever. They would, you know, he kicks out the windscreen or his feet get stuck in the window or whatever. There's always like a funny little thing with it that just kind of makes you remember. And it's things like, like the towel setting on fire in Godfather 2. And there's, you know, there's like little things that just kind of make it stand out, as you say, make it a little bit different, and it just sticks in your mind, doesn't it?
Exactly, but otherwise you're left with quite a formulaic story, you know. I mean, a lot of police procedurals, although they're, you know, extremely popular with readers, Some do fall foul, I think, of being quite formulaic. You know exactly what's coming, and the murders don't often differ very much from one another. And I just want to steer clear of my stories being interchangeable with other people's stories wherever possible. And I want to push myself to write something innovative and entertaining and challenging. And in fact, I'm heavily influenced by Tarantino. And some of the US series like Breaking Bad and The Wire, and they're always very, very good with innovative murder. I mean, I absolutely loved it in The Wire, where there was the bloke and the woman. I can't remember the names offhand. Chris and I can't remember. They were putting bodies in.
In the houses,
derelict buildings.
They
were burning them with acid and then locking them up with the nail gun. And it's just that level of innovation that it's just captivating. It captivates you as a reader. You just a bit like you remember when Fred West, all the murders were discovered. You were kind of macabrely captivated and wanted to find out more about all these bodies that were being dredged up in his garden. And I think that there is that appetite for novel and new and different, and that's why Silence of the Lambs was so very, very popular, because they had a cannibal and a man who made lady suits out of real ladies.
And just in general, why people are so fascinated by serial killers.
Well, I think people like to take a walk on the wild side vicariously.
Absolutely.
I think that's what it is. And people like, Sudoku is very popular. So people in their literature like to solve puzzles.
Absolutely. Well, you're going to obviously keep writing them for them and keep setting these puzzles and these novel approaches. So what's up? What's up next for you? So you mentioned the George McKenzie novels coming out later this year. Is that April? Did you say?
Yeah, April. I think it's the 19th, and finally that series is going to be available in print. Hooray!
Brilliant.
And then after that, I'm not sure. I've come up with some new story outlines. And I feel drawn to writing a standalone because I think I could do with a bit of a breather from series, which are great to do because you really get into your characters and you can take them to all sorts of lovely, unexpected places. But it would be quite nice to write, a standalone, so a succinct story that didn't need to go anywhere else.
That's exactly what Tony Schumacher was saying last night. He's written a series and he's writing a standalone at the minute for that very reason. He said he needed a breather and take his head out of that world for a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. Or just start something new, start a new series perhaps. But I know with George McKenzie and Van den Bergen I love, and I always surprise myself by doing a story I really enjoy writing, coming up with a new storyline. But after 5 books, I'm not saying it gets stale, but you definitely need a break.
Keep it fresh, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It is about keeping it fresh and keeping yourself interested in the job because, writing long full-length fiction is a marathon, not a sprint. So you have to keep your mind on it. You can't afford
pace yourself. Yeah, absolutely. All right, brilliant. Well, where can we wrap it up then now? So where can people find more about you online and on Twitter and everything else?
Well, I have a website that I don't change very often, but it's got all the basic information on there, and that's marnieriches.com. On Facebook, you can find me, Marnie Riches Author. And on Twitter, I'm at Marnie_Riches with a capital M and a capital R. And that's mainly where I chat to readers. Yeah, I've got quite a large online presence. I intermittently do Instagram as well, but there's just not enough hours in the day to take pictures.
No, I know what you mean.
Me in my pajamas and what I'm having for lunch.
I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate that. I'll put all that stuff in the show notes as well. But it's been great speaking to you, and good luck with the book that will be out as this podcast is released. So brilliant.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me, Wayne.
There you go, that was the talented and fascinating Marnie Riches, and I'll put all of those links in the show notes over at joinedupwriting.co.uk. So what did you think to the show? If you like it, let me know. If you don't, well, also let me know, and you can do that in the comments on the website, on the Facebook page, or on Twitter at JU Podcast. If you do enjoy the show, I'd be eternally grateful if you could take 30 seconds to leave me a quick rating and review on iTunes, because that's how more people can find the show, and it also means I can continue to attract great guests like Marnie today and provide more great content. So that wraps up things for another week, but don't forget you can find the entire back catalogue of interviews on the website, and that next week we'll have Marnie's bonus epilogue quick listen episode where we chatted about dealing with self-doubt. So thanks for listening. I'm Wayne Kelly. Happy writing and reading, and I'll see you next time.
Joined up